Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 851. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, the SPaMCAST 851 features our interview with Mike Paciello. Accessibility, which should be a basic human right, has always been a struggle, and now it seems to be even farther from reality. Mike and I talked about what defines accessibility, issues, and why this is an ethical issue and not just a legal issue. Mike Paciello is Chief Accessibility Officer at AudioEye, Inc., where he drives advancements in digital accessibility. He previously founded WebABLE, delivering insights on disability and accessibility technology, and authored the pioneering book Web Accessibility for People with Disabilities, recognized by President Bill Clinton in 1997 for his role in the Worldwide Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative. Mike has advised the U.S. Access Board and other federal agencies since 1992. An international leader in accessibility and usability, he's also founded the Paciello Group, a leading software accessibility consultancy acquired by Vispero in 2017. Are you ready to talk accessibility? It's time for our conversation. Michael Paciello, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. Really excited to talk to the audience.
Well, I'm excited. I'm excited to talk to you. The audience, they can. No, I'm kidding. I like my audience generally. All right, so Michael, I like starting by getting some basic, some basic words down so that we all understand where we're going. Let's start real foundational. What is digital accessibility?
It's making anything that is on the web or the internet, things that we interact with on the web today, usable, that's a key word, and accessible to people with disabilities.
What does the word usable mean?
That is such a great question, because quite often, and for years, we used to just talk about strictly accessibility. So people with disabilities, they interact with their laptops, their computer systems, their mobile devices in different ways than a person without a disability. So, for example, a blind person, common illustration is a blind person uses a mechanism called a screen reader, an application that reads back what's on the screen, whether it's graphical or text or what have you, to a blind person. So, accessibility is about making sure that whatever they are rendering through their browser, to again use an easier way of identifying it, is compatible with their assistive technology, that screen reader, those devices that they use to interact with. That's being accessible. Some people will go one step further in saying accessibility is about meeting compliance requirements that have been established by the World Wide Web Consortium. That's partially true. That's not fully true, because that's where the usability comes in. I could make content on a web page, for example, so that it will render through a screen reader to a blind person. But that doesn't mean that the workflow or, how it is that the process they need to go through in order to purchase something on the web is usable. So being usable means it's not just rendering data that's accessible to the assistive technology, but it means that they understand exactly what they're doing step by step. If you want them to interact with you, make a purchase, buy a service, whatever it is that you've got them doing on your website.
So this sounds like it's predominantly something that an organization that has customer facing or some sort of interface with the public has to worry about. Is it something that an organization that's we're all internal, we're just doing stuff for ourselves? Should they be worrying about accessibility?
Perhaps even more so. Primarily because the Americans with Disabilities Act protects individuals who are hired, by a company, by an organization. So if you hire a blind, a deaf, a person who is perhaps in a wheelchair, individuals into your company, you need to ensure that you accommodate them. The law requires that you accommodate them according to their disability. If your systems, how you operate, are all computerized, which most are, and they all have an internet and web infrastructure, right? Internal webs and whatnot. and those systems are not usable and accessible to people with disabilities, you can have some problems.
Having worked in a number of organizations over my career, some of which are no longer in existence, I'm pretty sure that a lot of them weren't accessible and probably not accessible and well past the Americans with Disabilities Act
Mhm.
timeframe. So it isn't that they shouldn't have been, that they weren't. Is this part of the issue?
Without a doubt. There's no doubt about it. Employment for people with disabilities is just as important as it is for an individual who's not a person with a disability. And, how they make their living, the things that they have to do, their work environment needs to be usable and accessible. Before before the ADA, an organization or company, if they wanted to make an accommodation, they did it basically out of the goodness of their hearts, really. Some organizations I know I worked for, I've been in the software industry now since the 80s, early 80s, and the company that I work for was very proactive in terms of accommodating their employees, including those with disabilities. But once the web and software came out, became the norm for all of us to live in, the digital society that we do, things became a lot more challenging and a lot harder for them as an organization to accommodate because they weren't just relying on their own capacities. They were relying on the application developers, the software applications and whatnots that they were buying in order to make sure that they were accessible. And quite often they weren't. So if I were buying not to call anyone out specifically, but just say I've got an application that relies on a database, right? So there are all kinds of database manufacturers and vendors that are out there. Quite often, we would go out, link our applications up to those DBs, and they could not be used. The data was not renderable to a person who was blind or low vision or otherwise.
So these people are, well, if we're talking compliance, they're out of compliance at this point. Both the person who bought or is leasing, buying, whatever the approach that they take to acquire the software, and the people that are building the software. Why isn't that a problem?
From what perspective? You mean legally? Why is that a problem?
Both legally and,
Yeah,
I teach ethics. So
right.
I would argue that that's sort of an ethical problem too.
Well, I wouldn't even I would begin to argue with you on that. There's absolutely no doubt it's an ethical problem. Why is it that we would, if we're hiring someone, we hired them because they're qualified to perform whatever task or whatever work it is that we hired them for. If they need certain things, if I get, again, if I get hired in an office job, right? I usually can count on the fact that when I walk into an office, it's got a desk and it's got a chair and maybe a whiteboard. There's certain things that we might take for granted as just, as human beings and not think about what other accommodations I might need, whether I'm a person with a disability or not. So yeah, there's a lot of thought that has to go in. It's why HR over the years have upped their game, so to speak. More recently, we've had a lot around DE&I. Of course, that's all up for grabs right now, given the current climate of things around the world. But that's a real issue. And DE&I came out as a result of the very things that you and I are talking about: ethics, accommodating individuals under whatever environment they might work in.
So in scenarios where companies have chosen, or in essence, they're stuck. They have to buy a piece of software. The people that they're buying from aren't compliant. In some instances, they're probably not. Once you've started going down a path, there are not a lot of options.
Hmm.
How do they deal with that? I mean, what's a path for them to at least get under control if they can't write the software themselves, let's say?
Yeah. So I'll give you two great examples of
Oh,
what's been
excellent.
going on over the last 10 or 15 years. So for the last 10 years or so, there is at the federal level, the federal government level, and it tends to trickle down into the states and some of the municipalities as well. But the federal level, there is a law that's called Section 508. And that law essentially mandates the procurement, the maintenance, the development, the deployment of technology to make sure that it is usable and accessible to people with disabilities. So if I'm the Social Security Administration and I'm, to follow your scenario, going out and I'm buying an application to install on my servers so that all of my employees can use it, the requirements documents around that purchase have, mandates inside it, standards inside it, technical requirements that call for accessibility. So now, on the other side of it, if I'm selling to the federal government, I've got to make sure that my software is or meets those requirements if I want to make a sale, right? So that works out really well at the federal and state level where those laws now are pretty much in place. And by the way, that's not just true here in the US, that's true just about everywhere else in the world right now. The EU is about to put into effect by next summer, by June of 2025. The EU has a brand new accessibility mandate, and it's all about enforcing accessibility at that level. You develop, you maintain, you sell, you procure, et cetera, and so forth, technology. Now, if you're a business in the US, now you've got your own internal policies need to up their game and more or less mimic what has been written in this Section 508 code. In especially a lot of Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies have done exactly that. At the C level, they're writing down, they've written in policies, company policies, built on what we call the maturity models that use the same basic guidelines and principles that the federal government does to, again, ensure that whatever they procure, whatever they maintain, whatever they develop is usable and accessible to people with disabilities. So that's how it's pretty much done today, and why, while I still feel there's quite a bit of work to do, we are so much further ahead than we were when I first got in this business. It's almost remarkable.
We got into the business, it sounds like, roughly at the same time, albeit my hair is a whole heck of a lot grayer than yours is, which I'm sitting here gritting my teeth a bit.
Well, at least you have hair,
Well,
right? So the audience doesn't know they're listening in here.
this could be painted on. People don't know. I'm kidding. Are things better than they were in the 1980s?
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Is that because governments have stepped in and made these mandates and passed these laws?
It's not just governments, but governments play a big role in it, right? An old friend of mine, a colleague of mine, used to say, if you want to get new business up and running, you do one of two things. You either come up with a brilliant idea, like Facebook, and you run with it and you make, all kinds of dollars and cents out of that, or you write a law to enforce it. So that's where the government's role really has come into play. Section 508, Section 255, the Telecommunications Act, the CVAA, Communication Video and Accessibility Act. These are all laws that have been designed, developed, and now promulgated by the U.S. federal government, in addition to the Americans with Disabilities Act, that promote compliance at that level, that ensure that the lives of individuals with disabilities are better, and they can take advantage of technology. The other side of that is the business that I've been in, and that is the standards side of the business. So you've got ISO, you've got the World Wide Web Consortium, you've got ANSI, you've got IEEE. These are typical technology standards organizations who have also, and really for me, it really started in the early 80s, where I really started to see the maturity come in and standards are being written to make sure that things are usable and accessible.
Why did you get involved in this topic?
Yeah, it's a question everybody asks me. I don't have a family member with a disability. I was a technical writer for a company called Digital Equipment Corporation. So if you've been around since the 80s, you probably remember DEC, right?
I do remember DEC.
Yeah.
I used to do coding on a PDP too. So,
My first was a PDP-8. So not quite back as far as you. And I did almost all of my work as the VAX came out, but that's going down another trail, right?
Yep.
So as a technical writer, I was asked by a manager of mine to take on a volunteer project. And that project basically was to take our computer documentation, which, as you can remember back then, was, operating system focused and volumes upon volumes of documentation. Take the hard copy versions of those and bring them to the National Braille Press in Boston, Massachusetts. And it was a very interesting visit, as you can imagine. I had never really interacted or seen Braille, certainly hadn't seen the production of Braille at that particular time, so I had no clue what I was walking into, and I just figured, hey, I hand off the books and they'll do what I do, right? Working on electronic files. They didn't. We would give them those volumes of documentation, and then folks that were working at the NBP would use these Braille typewriters and hand type those documents page by page. 3 pages of Braille to 1 print page. So it gives you an idea of how much work there was there.
I've seen a Braille typewriter. A friend of mine, brother, her brother was blind, and we went to high school together. He was a year older than I was, so yeah, definitely understand that. I mean, that's a talent in its own right. All of this stuff makes a ton of sense. It makes sense both internal and external. We're coming to a world where we're using generative AI and other forms of AI, machine learning, to actually do a lot of this heavy lifting. Is that
Right.
going to be a bane or boon to the world of accessibility?
Yeah, both. It's going to be both.
Why does it have to be both? I knew that. I sort of knew that was the way this was going to go.
So the positive side, individuals with disabilities are using forms of AI in their day-to-day life, just like you and I are, and it's improving their ability to, produce documents, produce applications, and things along those lines. Where the challenge comes in, ironically, us starting this conversation off about ethics, is at that point. Others who are producing AI-based applications, and a great example would be like HR-driven applications that are using AI to go out and determine who should be hired, right? And so the algorithms, in simple words, and the math used to generate that are always going towards the center. Give us this type of person. The data is coming from the outside, becoming more and more narrower, so that I narrow down, how many people I'm going to hire based on the 10,000 resumes that I've received. The problem with that is people with disabilities tend to live on the edges. And so the big concern right now where AI is involved is bias, is literally user bias in terms of edging out people with disabilities, leaving them out of the equation. And a lot of that has to do with the way that the LLMs are and the requests that they're making, how that job description goes out. It probably doesn't say, and we've seen them. It probably doesn't say whether this person is blind or deaf or is in a wheelchair or whatnot. It doesn't have that kind of data built into the algorithm to keep them in. And so, because the description of that request through the AI doesn't include that, they're edged out. They're already left out. This is a big problem.
Yeah, how does one test for a bias like that in a large language model?
Well, I guess I'm probably not the best person to talk about that. There are other people in our company that are the AI developers. I imagine that this is very similar to any type of code review. You usually come up with requirements. So do the requirements for that application that's being developed, do they include individuals with disabilities in the requirements doc? Then do the devs who are building the applications, the AI-based applications, do they have the components and the objects that ensure that it's accessible and look for the right for the right data point at that level? Now, this is all being fed into a machine, so you're writing that code. So basically, there's a QA process associated with, is this code that we're writing to create and generate this software application that goes out and then does the recruitment, again, using the HR analogy, does it include what's needed to ensure that people with disabilities are part of that recruitment process?
In terms of accessibility and making sure that people, there's a couple of sides to this. One is the HR, the ability to hire people and bring the right people to the table so that they can actually get interviewed. The other side to AI is as it's interacting and training itself. to run a process or to work through a workflow inside of an organization. People are in there.
Right.
At what point does that large language model get so biased that it can't see the difference between someone who's limited and some person who isn't limited? I'm using the wrong words, and I'll edit that because I don't like that. But
Yeah, no. I kind of follow where you're going with that. I'm actually kind of stepping back and thinking about that. I'm wondering, is that a bad thing or a good thing? I mean, the reality is people with disabilities, if you know, a lot of my friends and colleagues are themselves individuals with disabilities. And one of the big things that forever, as far as I know, I don't want to be treated differently. I do want my technology to be usable and accessible to me so that I can work and enjoy life the way that you do. I want to shop on Amazon just the way that you do. You know, I want to watch Netflix just the way that you do, right? So they want to do all the same things that you and I want to do on a day-to-day basis. I don't want to be treated differently. But the fact that I need to, as a software developer, as an architect, as an engineer, I need to, one of my favorite phrases, that I've used for many years is think accessibility. If you're not a designer, a developer who understands that there are people who are blind using your application or using your AI, well then sure, you're not going to code. You're not going to code for it. You're not going to account for it, right? The things that a person needs to do. If your LLM is excuse me, is using some sort of chatbot, and in that chatbot, in very simple form, can't speak to me. It's just pure text. And the screen reader can't render it, which would be unusual because generally speaking, that's the easiest thing for a screen reader for the blind to render. But if for whatever reason it couldn't read what was being displayed on the screen, that's a problem. The only way to prevent that from happening is the designers, the developers, the requirements people, all these people that I talked about before. You need to make sure that it's there. That they are telling the LLM how to parse properly.
so any number of software process and measurement cast listeners are, they're in the trenches. They're coding or they're managing people that code or test and all of those wonderful things. What piece of advice would you give them in terms of understanding what accessibility is and how to learn enough to actually deal with it?
You're right. Yeah, great question. So a lot of what we talk about today is the software development lifecycle, right? SDLC or agile development. And there are a number of processes right there that by principle, a good designer, a good developer, a good tester will make sure that things are accessible. Having said that, if I don't know anything about accessibility, the best place to go is go to the World Wide Web Consortium. Go to the W3C, w3c.org/WAI, which is Web Accessibility Initiative, right? And right there, you'll open up the world of accessibility. That was how we designed and organized that entire environment so that developers, designers, testers could have access. All of the knowledge that's needed is there for them to learn. Now, there are lots of other places. Companies like my own, AudioEye, we produce all kinds of learning and training materials for devs and for our clients, in addition to all the tools that we produce. But just on the learning, the knowledge side of it, it's just about everywhere. There's an organization out there called Teach Access that I had the privilege of helping to start up back up. Boy, I think it's been 10 years now. And their whole mission is about teaching accessibility in colleges, in post-secondary institutions, and to get them to integrate that into their computer science degree programs, for example. So that's another big thing. We've got to get into the education environment so that we're teaching professionals, we're teaching students out of the box, how to design and develop things that are usable and accessible to people with disabilities.
You're the Chief Accessibility Officer. That's a title that I don't run across very often. And, I like looking at titles. What's a Chief Accessibility Officer? And is that a typical thing that people should be looking for in organizations?
There should be one in every organization
Is
at every
there?
C level. Say that again?
Is there?
No, there's not. There's
Okay.
quite obviously not. I couldn't tell you how many there are in the world. I know about, a couple of dozen. Microsoft has one, Google has one, Meta has one, Apple. Does Apple have one? Apple has a lead. I'm not sure if they have an actual chief accessibility officer.
Hmm.
We're out there. It is, the C-level position in which we lead the entire organization. We're responsible to make sure that our organizations are not just accommodating our employees, but whatever, assuming that we're in the business. And again, I run in the technology space, so I'm really more familiar with that than I am with others. We're making sure that the technology that we produce and our employees produce is usable and accessible, and it meets those requirements. So it is truly a leadership role, and it's more about leading, talking, doing shows like this, educating, building awareness around accessibility, and hoping the rest of the world follows right along with us.
It's 2024. We are we're a quarter of a way into this century. Why are we still having this conversation? Why is this not just part and parcel of how work gets done?
Yeah, I really wish you hadn't put it that way, because when I started back in the early 80s, I was sure that by 2000 we'd have this whole thing resolved. In my book, I wrote about pervasive accessibility and laid out a whole map of how we could design and make systems that talk about the essence of what AI and the potential of what AI can do at a personalization level. That system's now adapted to the user instead of me as a user with a disability having to use a special technology. The system knows I have that technology and does everything right. I had thought that we would have accomplished that by now. We haven't. Of course, when I first started this business, there was no such thing as the web. The internet was barely a thing, right? In fact, there weren't even any PCs at that particular time. I mean, outside of a Commodore, a Commodore, right? Or what was the other one that was made by Radio Shack, right?
No. There was a third. There was the Atari 800, which is what I learned to code on.
I had the Atari. I had the Commodore as well. Yeah, you're all right. So look at where we were. We're talking 80s now. That's just 40 years ago. But look how many things have changed and evolved from in technology. There's almost no hardware anymore. Everything is done software. I never thought I'd see that age, right? I'm glad. I actually gave a talk several years ago at the Assistive Technology Industry Association's conference. They have that every end of January. And the title of my talk was The End of All Assistive Technology. And the chair of that conference, the president of that organization, almost shot me, right? Because so much of what is designed for people with disabilities, a lot of it is hardware, some sort of hardware, adaptive or assistive technology. So, but it was all about what I envisioned the world being, where it would be all software, and these things would adapt and personalize as much as possible to people with disabilities.
Well, maybe as AI has become more pervasive, then maybe that can happen. Michael, this has been absolutely fantastic. If you woke up tomorrow morning, someone handed you your caffeinated beverage of choice and a magic wand and said you had two wishes in how accessibility is being addressed in the wide world around us, what would those two wishes be and why?
Yeah, so I think one goes to what I just talked about. There's no reason why pervasive accessibility could not exist. The only way it's going to exist is if we learn how to develop personalization so that the emerging technologies that we use today at every level are usable and accessible to people with disabilities. That's my ultimate goal. That's where I'm headed. I don't know many more years I have left in this life, at 66, but
50,
that's
60,
still my goal.
you still
Yeah,
got
yeah.
you're halfway. All right. So that's
Exactly.
one. That's
That's
one.
one. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I think kind of falls into the bucket that you talked about in ethics. I really do wish somehow we could teach the world to sing, to quote an old phrase. And in this case, teach the world to think accessibility. People with disabilities don't want to be called out. They don't want to be different. They just want to be able to do what you and I do every day. So it would be great to live in a world where we just accepted individuals how they are, regardless of what their intellect abilities are, what their physical, abilities are and capabilities are, their sensory capabilities, and we just work together. Seriously.
You can't argue that. Hey, so you have a podcast. You have 2 podcasts. You want to tell us
I
about
do.
those before we start to wrap?
Yeah, sure. At AudioEye, we have our podcast. It's called Hearsay. And basically, we're talking to, a lot of folks, individuals in the disabilities industry and technology industry. The second one that I have is with a little side hustle, if you will, side company that I've had around for many years called WebABLE and WebABLE TV. And we've been doing basically internet TV and podcasts through WebABLE. We have a Web Accessibility Champions series that we really love. We've been able to pull a lot of great folks into it. So those are the 2 that I do.
Cool. I will have links to those in the show notes.
Thank
Michael,
you.
yeah, this has been absolutely marvelous. How would people continue the conversation? How would they find out about you? How would they find out about not only your company, but your side hustle company?
Yeah. Well, so I work for AudioEye. That's audioeye.com. Pretty easy enough. You'll see a bio of me up there. I write blogs. So a number of blogs that are up there. So that's one way to do it. My email address at AudioEye is michael.paciello@audioeye.com. Or you can contact me through WebABLE, which is mpaciello@webable.com. WebABLE primarily is in the media and news aggregation space. We usually do a search of about 5,000 to 6,000 articles just on people with disabilities, lives, technology, etc. And we use IBM Watson X to
Wow.
deliver it and post that and get that out to the world. So either way, you can contact me that way.
Super. At this point, I open up the platform for you to promote anything that you'd like. The podcast has been around for, when this runs, it'll be just beginning its 19th year. So, platform's yours. Selling your car on eBay, probably. If it's around another 19, you don't want those calls 19 years from now.
Yeah, I think it's great. I'm long out of the plugging myself business. I don't need to. I've been around for, to the point where I'm ancient in my own industry. I just like sharing more and more about accessibility. If anyone has any questions whatsoever, please. I'm never too busy to respond to an email or a text message, or I'm on all the social networks that are out there: LinkedIn, Facebook, Blue Sky, X, Twitter. Well, Twitter doesn't exist anymore, right? Uh, so it's pretty easy to reach out to me. I will say one thing. I was at Cal State University Northridge, their college of it was the College of Health and Human Development. I'm looking at, well, folks can't see, but I'm looking over here on the side. I just came back from there a few weeks ago from an event that they had. One of the things that I have been very interested in over the last few years on a personal level is caretaking. My first wife passed away a few years ago from brain cancer, and I was a caretaker for some 17 years, working and caretaking for her, along with my kids. And I have found a couple of things. One is there's not enough support out there for caretaking. There's not enough guidance in the college at Cal State. That's what they're all about: providing guidance and direction, teaching people how to be better caretakers. I challenge them. And the challenge that I said is, one of the other big problems that we have? Nursing homes and assisted living homes, places of that nature, the way that they're constructed today, as everything else, it's all about being a business, right? So really caring for individuals and taking care of them in an optimal way is missing. The whole human interaction aspect and caring for people, it's missing. So I challenged them to build a model nursing home. And as it turned out, at that particular meeting, I was speaking at this particular event. There were several of the board members to that organization and funders that were there. And the next thing I knew, after that talk, they were talking about, okay, let's put some money into this. Let's make this thing happen. So my hope is we'll take a big step forward in terms of caretaking and nursing care.
Having had family members go through that process and other family members closing in on it, Yeah, I hear you. And that would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Michael Paciello, thank you again for spending time with the Software Process and Measurement Cast listeners.
Thanks so much, Tom, for having me on your show. And again, just one more plug in terms of if anyone in your audience, please feel free to reach out and talk to me anytime.
Remember, the Software Process and Measurement Cast is sponsored by the book Mastering Work Intake by Jeremy Willits and Tom Cagley. That's me. Link in the show notes. Buy a copy of the book. Get your backlog under control. In Reread Saturday Notes, in Chapter 4 of Development is Freedom, Sen states that value is generated based on freedoms a person enjoys that allows them to lead the life they have reason to value. This leads to the postulate that poverty must be seen as a deprivation of basic capabilities rather than merely as loneliness of incomes. Links in the show notes to this week's installment of Reread Saturday of Development is Freedom by Mark Dessen and all previous installments. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 852, we will feature an essay on scaling attention. Unlike many things, attention doesn't scale, no matter how hard we try. So why do people try so hard? We'll also have a visit from the evolutionary agilist Jeremy Barrio. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet? And the 3-year-olds say, do we really have to go?